All right, this is from John chapter 13. Jesus became troubled in his spirit, and he testified and he said, I tell you truly, one of you will betray me. The disciples began to look at one another, at a loss to know who he was speaking of. Now, there was one disciple, the one who was leaned up against Jesus. When they ate, they all leaned on each other. They didn't sit in chairs. So the one who was leaning up against Jesus, known as the beloved disciple, he was called, Peter, indicated to him, ask him who he's talking about. And so he leaned up to Jesus. He said, who is it? Jesus said, the one for whom I shall dip a morsel and give it to him. He's the one. So when Jesus had taken the bread and dipped it, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. It was after eating that piece of bread that finally Satan entered into him. And Jesus said to him, what you do, do quickly. Now those who were there at the table, they had no idea what Jesus was talking about. They thought that because Judas was the treasurer and had the money box, that Jesus was telling him to go buy some supplies for the feast, or perhaps that he should go and give some alms to the poor. But Judas, after finishing the eating of that morsel, he went out immediately into the night. I sometimes have surprising, unexpected conversations with people. I had been talking to a woman on the phone, not someone I knew really well, so I didn't really know much. But my life is that way. And she had gotten a box. A box had been shipped to her from her son. He'd gone into jail, and he'd been arrested and put in jail. And there was, I guess it was from the apartment that he had. It was like some papers and some stuff like that or whatever. And it got taped up and shipped to her at his request. And she happened to mention to me that she'd received this box. And then she said, there was something evil in there. I had nightmares, and oh my, I probably shouldn't have opened it. Now, you have to understand that does not fit the way my world operates. Okay? My world is not a horror movie where evil hides in a box, and if you open it up, you let it out, right? But I recognize, and the longer I live, the more I recognize this, that there is evil. That it does exist. Whatever it is, it has some kind of presence. I remember, and this is one that just sticks in my head, and some of you have been around a long time, will have heard me mention Frances Maves, who was murdered by a guy named Thomas Ball back in the 80s. And she had come from the church I was serving at the time of her death. She lived in Las Vegas and was murdered. And so I ended up doing her funeral, and then did a lot of pastoral support of her parents as they dealt with what came later, the trial, and the murderer was convicted and sentenced to death. And there was on one of those like hard copy or one of those TV shows from back then. Remember those things? Yeah, it was one of those, and somebody did an interview with him. And I just happened to stumble upon it late at night, and as he was talking, it was like, I couldn't believe, it was like his eyes were dead. It was like a shark. It was just, I'm like this, oh my goodness, evil, right? But my brain doesn't normally go there. I just want you to know that. My brain does not normally go there. But when we have stories like the story of Judas, it makes us wonder. It really does. Because, when Judas betrays Jesus, the initial response everyone has is complete shock. Like, what? That's unbelievable. He was one of us. And then later on, he gets worse. He becomes more villainous. Well, he was really a thief. He was embezzling from the money box all along. Kind of gets worse over time, and people began to paint him out worse and worse. And then when we get here to John, the devil entered into him. Right? Somebody asked me about that. Did Jesus stick the devil in him with that morsel, or what was the deal there? So let me kind of explain something quickly. There's a thing that I talk about this in confirmation class, so my confirmation kids hear this story, but I tell this story. It's hypothetical. A woman decides she's sick and tired of her husband. She says, I'm going to kill him. She's been telling herself this. Tyler's going, yep, I've heard this one before. Yes. Just because this is this is what Einstein would call a mind experiment or a thought experiment. So she decides that she's going to kill him. And so at least she's got that in her head. So she buys a gun. And then she gets some bullets. And then she goes to the range and learns how to shoot. And then, he comes home night after night, and he's the same guy. Nothing ever changes. And one day she just decides, I've had it. He'd come in, and instead of enjoying the lovely meal that she's prepared, she sits on the couch with it in his lap and eats it in silence while watching TV, and she's just had enough. And she comes up behind him with the gun and points the gun at the back of his head and pulls the trigger. At what point does she become a murderer? You see, there's a point that she's crossed a line prior to the actual pulling of the trigger. A point at which the thought, I'm going to kill him, has become an act of intention and an act of will. By the way, the thought experiment goes on, but we don't need to go into where it ends up because it's an interesting thing about reality and stuff. But the point is that there's this line, this moment, that goes from Judas is thinking about doing this to Judas actually does it. Now, he's already made arrangements to betray Jesus. But it's one thing to enter into the conspiracy, but there's another thing to cross that line of full commitment. And this appears to be the moment of full commitment when Jesus looks at him and says, what you're going to do, you go do. And Judas' reaction is, fine. By the way, if you're familiar with the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, that moment is really powerfully represented. Jesus says, go do it. And he says, you want me to do it? If you knew why, I'm going to do it. And Jesus' response is, I don't care why you're going to do it. Leave me and go. It's a really amazing moment in the song. So check that out. Just go back and listen to that musical and listen to that piece. But this is a moment when Judas shifts from a guy who's setting up the betrayal, thinking about the betrayal, like the woman buying her gun, but then this is the moment when he says, I'm committed to this course of action. I am going to do it. He becomes the betrayer hours before the actual betrayal. This is the moment it comes. So this is the moment when he's now opened himself up to become the adversary, to become the devil. So the language of the devil enters into him. I don't know if how literal I want to take that, but I recognize what this means for him. So we look at Judas, though. If, the way people look at their neighbor, who they discover was really a serial killer or something. He seemed so nice, right? He lived on my block, and after a while, you start to paint him as this villain. I remember he gave me the creeps. Right? People who got along with him perfectly good, remember that he gave them the creeps later. Right? Because this is the way it works. What we do is we start to paint people with the broad brush. We begin to see them as entirely evil. But one of the things that the story tells us, that hints to us, is something much more troubling to us. It also is a little bit why we paint people with the brush. We want them to be entirely evil. We want Judas to be entirely a villain from the beginning. We want every evil person we run across to be entirely villainous from the beginning, to have no redeeming value whatsoever, because it saves us from something else. Here's what it saves us from. You have to look at the disciples. Jesus makes that comment, one of you will betray me, and they're all looking at each other like, what? We get to ask him which one of us it is. In one of the other Gospels, we get this. They quietly sneak up to Jesus at different times and say, "It's not me, is it?" Did you ever take a psychology class? If you have come across a couple of sets of experiments. One of them called the Milgram experiments. These are early 60s. Another one's called the Stanford Prison experiments. And the way those worked, the Milgram experiment was trying to answer the question about, really, it was looking at the issues around Nazis and, how could Nazis do these terrible things, especially in the concentration camps, and how did that work? And so what they did was they set up this experiment where, a volunteer comes in, and there's another volunteer, and there's a person in a lab coat. And the person in the lab coat explains, hey, what we're doing is a research on education learning theory, and we're going to use a negative feedback loop to help people learn. And so, each one has to feel this, so they put a little electrode on them and give them a little shock. And so if they give it a wrong answer, they get a little shock, and this helps them get the right answer. That's the theory. We're testing that theory. Then they flip a coin, and one of them stays out and has the button and the dial, which is marked, low, medium, high. Don't go past this line. They're going to die. It's how much electricity is in the little shock. And the other one goes into the other room. Now, what nobody knew at the time is that the person who's sitting there with the button was actually the lab rat. They were the volunteer. And both of the other two people were in on it. So it starts out, and the person in the lab coat is sitting there, and the questions get answered, and the person in the other room gives correct answers and wrong answers, and they're getting shocked. But they start to get more wrong answers. And the person at the button is, having to hit the button more and more often, and pretty soon the researcher in the lab coat says, turn it up to 2, knock it up a notch. And then later on, it's knock it up some more, knock it up some more. And the shouting gets worse and worse as each shock comes. It goes from, ow, ooh, ah, to, ah. And pretty soon they're screaming, oh, no, please stop, right? And the researcher's saying things like, no, turn it up. And they turn it past the red line, do not go past this line. And it's cranking it up. And the poor person with the button is looking at them, please don't, let's stop. No, you must put the button. There are tears streaming down their face. They're still pushing the button. And then there comes a point when there's no response coming from the other room, as if the other, all you can imagine is that they're dead or completely unconscious, and the researcher's saying, you must push the button. And they're weeping. But they're still pushing the button. These are ordinary people. The Stanford Prison experiment was sponsored by the Navy. The Navy was trying to figure out why they were having trouble in their military brigs. And so they hired a guy, Zimbaldi, I think his name was, to conduct some research. And what he did was he got a bunch of college kids, all males in this setting, because they had to model what was happening in a Marine Corps barracks in 1971. So there were 24 people involved. They were divided into two groups, guards and prisoners. And then there were 3 people in each group who were like the extras who would get brought in if somebody left. So you had basically 9 and 9. And what happened was, very, very quickly, the ones who were in the role of prisoners I think it was day 2, there was a prison riot. One of them went nuts and had to be pulled out and replaced by one of the alternates. This happened very, very fast. The guards became sadistic and coercive. And within 6 days, out of what was to be a 2-week experiment, 6 days, they had to stop it. So both of these experiments reveal something. It reveals that question that the disciples asked, who is it? It's not me, is it? Is a deep recognition of a truth. Now, I grew up Roman Catholic. We had a word for this. We called it original sin. In Calvinist theology, it's called total depravity. In the Bible, Paul refers to it as indwelling sin. That's the word he uses, indwelling sin. Or sometimes he uses the word the flesh. He doesn't mean body exactly. He means something else, but he sometimes uses the word the flesh. And Paul talks about this, and he says, if I want to do what's good, but I do what's wrong. If you want to look it up, it's Romans chapter 7. I want to do what's good, but I end up doing what is wrong. And so if I, the one who wants to do what is good, do what is wrong, it proves that it's not really me, but rather the indwelling sin within me. Who will save me from this deathly existence? This is the deeper truth. We like to paint the villains as completely villainous because it protects us from recognizing the darkness that we carry. That we're maybe one lab-coated technician with a clipboard away from pushing that button. Or that we're just one scenario away from being in a place where we act in ways that we never would have thought that we would have acted. And this is the scary part of this. This is the hard part of this. We are, even when we're walking the narrow way, we're inches from the darkness. We need a grace and a love which is surpassing. We need God to protect us from us. We need always that power and that purpose of God to push us away from that slippery edge that we're so close to, that always seems to dog us, always seems to be there. We need that amazing, profound, transformative grace to save us from the darkest parts of our own selves. Can you find the prayer response? And let's pray together. When someone I thought highly of does evil, I feel shock and confusion. Certainly there is some mistake, I protest. Then I begin to wonder, what caused this? What triggered such a thing? What alchemy brought evil out of one who was good? And I look for an external cause, some force or catalyst which could explain how it could be. But later I began to paint with a different brush, to cast one I called good as entirely evil. One never knows, I tell myself, and I come to believe that the one I thought I knew was really a devil all along. This reaction, as normal and commonplace as it is, conceals my real question, my true fear. Could that be me? Save me, Lord Jesus. Save me from my own darkest nature. Amen.